everyone, welcome to my talk on psychological safety for site reliability engineering teams. And let me mute this. All right. So just a little bit of background on me. I'm a senior engineer at Teachers Pay Teachers. Over the course of my career, I've been on many tech and engineering teams, and each team was its own unique, had its own unique set of way of doing things and set of problems. But in spite of the complexity of each of these teams, right, two things always seem to remain true. The first, right, is that teams always perform better when they feel psychologically safe. I'm sure this isn't surprising, right? Like, psychological safety is something we actually talk about somewhat frequently now in tech, especially since the pandemic started. But what I really want to emphasize here is that psychological safety is even more important for site reliability engineering teams because of the nature of our work. So every engineer, right, has at least one story of a time that they took down production or deleted some database, right? And the reason we remember these stories so vividly is because they were stressful at the time, right? Especially if we were less senior than we are maybe right now. And this is because incident management is stressful. And this is why SRE teams need to be particularly thoughtful about building a psychologically safe environment. So as a technical lead, this has been something that I've thought about a lot. So I'll spend the rest of my time reviewing some of the principles and practices I've found to be effective. Now, before I do that, did it go down? Okay. Yeah. But before I do that, let me take a step back about how I came to develop my style of leadership and management. So I mentioned previously how I worked at Google for education and Teachers Pay Teachers. But even before that, I worked at another small ed tech startup. I did computational research focused on education, on the education sector, worked at an EDU nonprofit, and spent hundreds of hours tutoring, teaching, and mentoring other students. So in other words, I've been thinking about education for pretty much my entire life. And one of the reasons for this is because I've always been obsessed with this idea that education should be a place where students are empowered to learn and become their best selves. And so many years ago, I encountered this idea of trauma-informed education, or trauma-informed teaching, which is basically a methodology that considers how trauma impacts learning and behavior. And so this approach or methodology resonated super deeply with me as someone who's a woman of color in the United States, where we face, daily trauma of racist patriarchy, and as someone who's purposeful about working on teams that don't only look like the cast of Silicon Valley. And so when I think about building psychologically safe teams, I come from an approach influenced by what I learned from trauma-informed education. Now, trauma-informed education has 7 core principles, but I'm only going to focus on 3, specifically the 3 I think are most important. So first, we have that psychological safety is created by building trust through respect, acceptance, and transparency. So what this means more practically is that expectations should always be clear. Right? We should always strive for standard practices while making it clear that mistakes and failure are an inevitable consequence of engineering and just being people. So this is why the blameless post-mortem culture is so important for site reliability engineering teams. Right? It allows us to embrace risk while having a process in place to learn from our mistakes and from failure. Secondly, the importance of empowerment, voice, and choice. You don't build trust within a team, right, and then just assume that you have it forever, right? Trust needs to be something that's maintained continuously. And so a winning strategy to continuously empower folks is to empower them to raise challenges and issues, knowing that they'll be addressed or even feel empowered to take on these issues themselves, right? Engineering is all about feedback loops, right? So take those feedback loops seriously, whether that's in the form of your company engagement scores, retros, one-on-ones, et cetera. And lastly, we have inclusion. The psychological safety of everyone on the team needs to be top priority, and harm and bias should never be tolerated, right? We build our culture with the most vulnerable people in mind first, because when we build for the most vulnerable people in mind, we're way more likely to end up building for everyone in mind. And so far, we've focused on the importance of psychological safety and some of the principles behind that. But I did mention that there were two things that always remain true for every team I've worked on. And the second is that chronic problems are the most common threat to psychological safety. And what I mean by this is that chronic problems threaten psychological safety by eating away at your team's ability to be resilient to change, and more importantly, failure. And the longer these chronic problems go unaddressed, especially if other new chronic problems are appearing as well, the more you risk burning out even some of the strongest teams. And so what I actually mean when I say, so let's talk about more like what specifically like qualifies as a chronic issue, right? It's kind of an ambiguous phrase, so let's characterize it further. So I think of two main characteristics that distinguish an issue from being chronic. The first is that these issues are repetitive and long-lasting, right? So think of any team that you're on, or any community really even, that you're part of, right? If you've been on that team or community long enough, right, you can probably quickly identify some of the problems that you see come up over and over again, right? And the severity of these chronic issues does vary widely, but each of these poses some risk to your culture, right? They are those flaky, failing end-to-end tests you keep ignoring because they pass on retry, but in the back of your mind, you know you should probably dig into it before it comes back to bite you in the butt, right? The second is that these problems tend to be very difficult to solve. This is probably part of why they become chronic in the first place, right? But this is part of why they're so important to solve. And SRE teams deal with chronic issues all the time. We'll talk about this more later, but for SRE teams, right, chronic issues often most commonly manifest themselves as toil. And so why do we care about chronic issues, right? Because like I said with my end-to-end test metaphor, right, chronic issues are our biggest indicators of complexity and organizational dysfunction. So let's get back to those principles from earlier, right? How do chronic issues impact trust, acceptance, and transparency? So when something is around for so long that you can depend on it to happen again, and it's something that your team collectively considers an issue, right, that probably means some shared value or principle is being violated, right? Maybe it's something as simple as the quality of your work isn't up to par with how you want to run your team. Or maybe it's something even more severe, like that person who says things that they shouldn't be, and we just kind of tolerate it anyway. These situations make people lose trust in your team's ability to hold your values truth, right? And more importantly, to solve important problems when they happen. Secondly, chronic issues directly impact a team's sense of empowerment, right? When an issue is allowed to go on for so long, especially without any action, people are left feeling unheard and unable to do anything about the situation they're in, right? And it leaves them feeling hopeless, and that's something that can be really, really detrimental to your culture. And lastly, chronic issues are also inclusion issues, because chronic issues are felt by our most vulnerable teammates first. And let me repeat that one more time, right? The flaws of an organization are always felt by the most vulnerable employees first. And bias itself is a chronic issue, right? Even the healthiest cultures have bias embedded in them. So when I asked you to think about some chronic problems earlier and you thought of none, then this is the first one to start with, because I guarantee you that chronic bias, is an issue for someone. So how do you make sure chronic problems don't kill your culture, right? Where are the points of intervention? And so I think there are three general points of intervention, right? The first is this more preventative state, which is that basically, right, you design your systems to actually reduce any problems from happening in the first place. The second is a more proactive state, which allows you basically to address issues early on by monitoring like early indicators of chronic issues. And then the third is the more reactive state, the state that we want to avoid at pretty much all costs, right? We address these issues when they've become chronic or when they become acute. So since toil is a large part of the SRE role, like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to focus the preventative measures you can take to address toil. So I started off this talk by saying like embracing risk and preparing for failure is a tenet of creating psychological safety, right? Problems will rise, it's inevitable. And success isn't only judged by the problems you avoid, right? It's also judged by how you iterate on feedback and areas of improvement. So we talked about how building trust requires meeting the need to be heard, right? Feedback loops are a way of doing that. So they serve the function of communicating pain points throughout the team. And what this can look like can vary widely. Every team has its own way of doing this. But the general idea here is that we should make it easy to find patterns that can serve as input for short-term and long-term improvements. Coupled with a robust feedback loop is a prioritization framework. So something like service level objectives. And these introduce basically an extra layer of accountability that will take your team a step closer towards being resilient to toil. SLOs, they tend to come with well-defined error budget policies, which are basically like, if this, then do that. So they introduce like a level of transparency with how we deal with chronic issues or with any issues that come along. Now, once you have an avenue for making sure your team is heard, a framework for holding yourselves accountable, how do we action feedback, since that's just as important as collecting it, right? So, as I said, right, managing toil is fundamental to site reliability engineering. So having both a short-term and long-term process for eliminating toil becomes really important for these teams. All right, we should be constantly learning from our feedback loops, like I just mentioned. And over time, right, we'll build up our collective knowledge of how to manage reliability effectively. And so this is why my style of engineering tends to lead more heavily on like design and production readiness phase of engineering. Now, I know we have to balance this with like being able to ship quickly, right? So when I say this, I think everyone's first instinct is to hold their breath because they think I mean I like to run my team slowly. But I've always found the opposite to actually be true, right? We invest early so that we don't have to run backwards after releasing a feature that ended up not being production ready. The most successful projects I've seen that, yes, were delivered on time, were the ones that a lot of thought was put into it more upfront, into the technical design and the production readiness parts of building software. Because ultimately, right, these are the things that made development a lot more smoother. And they built confidence for when we released our features. So when you're not in this mode, it's really hard to get here. It involves a degree of trust that the time you invest more upfront, right, will pay off later. And that trust isn't always there. So when I first introduced this way of engineering at my first team at TPT, I did hear a lot of these concerns over and over, if I'm being honest. Mostly from my cross-functional partners. So for the folks on teams who feel like rushing is causing a lot of your production problems, but feel like they're stuck in a cycle of rushing, just choose one project to try this out on and see how it goes. And when it goes well, and I say when it goes well, not if, use that model for driving longer-term change. Now, like I said, right, we have to complement our long-term approach with a short-term one. And again, since toil is super important to site reliability engineering teams, and also tends to be the most, a cause of our most stressful issues, so from like on-call issues, the shorter-term approach I like to take is to use our on-call shifts as dedicated on-call shifts. So what I mean by this is that instead of forcing on-call engineers to balance both on-call and long-term project work, which I think is really common now, empower engineers on call to take ownership over how they spend their time on call outside of incidents, of course. Right, so the benefit of this, right, is it not only relieves the stress of needing to manage incidents and project work at the same time, but it also communicates a trust in your teammates, right, to help make on-call better over time, right? It empowers developers to solve the problems that bother them the most. And I consider this more of a short-term approach because you won't be able to only rely on dedicated on-call to mitigate your issues, right? So not every issue or improvement, right, will be able to fit into an on-call shift. But it is an additional layer of reassurance, and it's another way of keeping your team accountable to itself. All right, so we've gone over some ways of preventing issues from happening, right? What happens when these issues do come up? Right, so first, right, I mentioned having to monitor for early indicators, right? This is where your feedback loops really come into action, right? Actually monitoring for things that come up continuously. If you see it being a source of increasing sync time on your team, that's something to pay attention to. Two, right, like revisit your processes continuously, right? Understand that your initial solutions might not be the ones that work long-term, right? And what this looks like, right, is usually in the form of retros. I know, especially in like agile development, right, we use retros a lot. Actually, like, action the things that come from your retros. 3, actually implement your learnings, right? This is another way of building trust, and on top of like actually improving the way that you do engineering, right? And 4, right, also verify and celebrate your solutions. So when they do work, right, like that should be something that you celebrate, because that means it's a problem that you all solved together. And then lastly, I'm going to take actually the opposite approach to my last 2 sections here and talk about what you shouldn't do in these cases. So these are the reactive measures, right? This is when when we are full, like, chronic issue in the thick of it, what do we do? And so the final stages of chronic issues, right, usually look like this. Heroism and burnout are very common. Heroism usually comes out first. Burnout usually comes shortly after. And here, right, when I say, heroism, I don't just mean in the form of just like overworking. That's the thing I think we think of first. It also means in the form of like forcing folks to endure an environment that isn't healthy for them, right? Maybe that means you're making the women on your team, for example, endure bias that they shouldn't have to over and over. And often this happens, right, in the name of other people's growth, right? But ultimately, right, like you have to think about the impact that it's having for all your teammates. Right, so I consider these anti-patterns, right? They are not effective solutions for organizational failures, right? This is one that we tend to use again, right? But it burns people out, right? Forces us to endure harmful environments, compromise our values, instead of preventing them from being in that position in the first place. So when we ask people to burn out, right, and it's usually never explicitly, right, what we're asking them to do is make up for organizational failures or debt by sacrificing their well-being. And at least for me as leader, I don't consider that something to be ethical. So what do we actually do when we get here, right? Unfortunately, I'm here to deliver some obvious but hard truths. So when your team reaches this state, right, ultimately, it's your leaders that are the ones who are responsible for organizational failures that got you here, right? Blameless post-mortem culture does not apply to leadership. And in fact, a crucial part of blameless post-mortem culture is that you shift towards identifying the systemic reasons that cause the problems, right? And so while blameless post-mortem culture might agree that the leaders are not at fault for these issues, blameless post-mortem culture definitely agrees that leadership is responsible for them. And this is the thing I think I see leaders struggle with more than anything else, right? It is really hard to reconcile the fact that most of the problems that you have to work on or solve aren't directly your fault, but that they are your responsibility. And that ironically, as much as we don't want to cast blame and whatnot, right, it's when we ignore our responsibilities as leaders that issues actually start to become our fault. Now, here's another hard truth. Sometimes you are that leader. And so while we can and should hold leadership accountable in the ways we have access to, the onus is ultimately on leaders to take responsibility. And so if you actually have the privilege of acting on that responsibility, do it. And you can do it in roughly 3 steps. I'm not just going to tell you to do it and then walk away. So when you're in this state, right, at this point, right, you've probably already lost trust or are at serious risk of losing it. So the first step in taking responsibility is admitting where you went wrong, right? Admit that you let it get this way. The people you lead will actually appreciate you a lot more for being vulnerable about where you went wrong, especially when you follow up with action. Because psychological safety, right, is about feeling safe when to make mistakes Because psychological safety is about feeling safe to make mistakes while trusting also that you're in an environment that seeks to minimize psychological harm through accountability. And this is the core of what I think it means to be trauma-informed, right? It's not just about feeling safe that we as individuals can make mistakes. It's also about preserving safety in spite of the mistakes that will inevitably end up happening. Which is why the second step of taking responsibility is centering the folks impacted. This is where we really need to practice empathy, right? Who was harmed in the process? Who had to step up as a hero or leader because you didn't? And lastly, the actual change you follow up with. That means revisiting the preventative and proactive measures you have in place, right? Depending on the situation, this might also require that you make really tough decisions. And it is really hard, right? But it is really crucial. Because again, psychological safety is essential for site reliability engineering teams. Thank you.
Thank you, Lesley. And I think we have time for questions. I want to make sure we've got, is Jared Jordan in the house? All right, if you want to come up and get set up, we can do a few questions in the interim. Anybody got a question for Lesley? You okay with questions?
Yeah.
We got a couple. There's one. I'm not quick, but I'm persistent.
So one question I have is, you had a slide where leaders are responsible for organization failure. In an agile environment, right, it is very hard to find only one leader.
Yeah.
Because they are self-managed teams. How do you then find a leader in that self-managed team?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the solution there is there usually isn't one leader, but there's usually at least a few, right? And those people, it's usually like, I think for these types of teams, like, your PM, your EM, TL, right? Product designer, right? Like, they should have a strong core that works on these things together, right? Like, there really shouldn't be one leader, actually. One thing I didn't mention here, right, is like the concept of the hero leader, right? Like, there shouldn't be one leader that you're so dependent on. So I think in some ways, right, like actually Agile sets us up for success because it builds a strong core that's responsible for the team's well-being instead.
Any other questions? Well, we got open spaces later, so be thinking of open spaces topics related to this talk, and I imagine you might pitch this as an open space topic yourself later.
Cool.
Who knows? We'll find out. Thanks so much, Lesley. Really enjoyed the talk. Glad you're here.